It sat on his wrist like a trophy. The Richard Mille, RM 1103, Felipe Massa. To the uninitiated, it was just a bulky, complicated timepiece. To those in the know, it was £250,000 of titanium and engineering, a symbol that screamed status louder than any supercar ever could. It was worth more than the average house in the city he terrorized. It was worth nearly 10 times the annual income he declared to the government. And in the end, that watch didn't just tell the time. It told the National Crime Agency exactly who Craig McKenzie was. It was the ticking time bomb that would blow his empire apart. This is not a story about a desperate man turning to crime to feed his family. This is a story about hubris. About a man who walked the grey streets of Manchester with such absolute confidence in his own untouchability that he mocked the law to its face. He was a ghost in the system, a shadow moving millions through the veins of the UK's criminal underworld. He believed he was bulletproof. He believed he was waterproof. He called himself Teflon, but he forgot one crucial rule of the game. Even Teflon scratches. And when the National Crime Agency finally kicked down his door in the quiet suburbs of Cheadle Hulme, they weren't looking for drugs. They were looking for the receipts. Manchester has always had a hard edge. From the Industrial Revolution to the acid house rave scene, it is a city of innovation and grit. But beneath the regeneration and the shiny glass towers of Deansgate, there is an ecosystem that has existed for decades. The underworld here is tight-knit, parochial and ruthless. To rise in this environment, you need more than just muscle. You need a brain. Craig McKenzie had both. Born and raised in the shadow of Wythenshawe, one of Europe's largest council estates, McKenzie learned the currency of the streets early. Respect isn't given. It is taken, and once you have it, you monetize it. His rise wasn't meteoric, it was calculated. In the chaotic landscape of Manchester's gang wars of the early 2000s, where dominance was often decided by ballistics, McKenzie operated differently. He understood that violence attracts heat, but logistics brings wealth. He positioned himself not just as a player, but as a facilitator, a man who could make things happen. Need a shipment moved? Call Craig. Need dirty, cash-washed, clean, so it can be spent on property and cars. Call Craig. He became the oil in the engine of Manchester's organised crime. But his legend truly began in the courtroom. Years before his final downfall, McKenzie had faced the ultimate test. He stood in the dock accused of one of the gravest crimes on the statute book: murder. The Crown Prosecution Service laid out their case. The police presented their evidence, and the city waited for the inevitable guilty verdict. But it never came. McKenzie was acquitted. He walked out of that court a free man, breathing the cold air of freedom while the police gnashed their teeth. That moment defined him. It warped his psychology. To survive a murder charge is to feel immortal. It confirmed what he had always suspected, that he was smarter than them. That he was slippery. That nothing would stick. The name Teflon wasn't just a nickname. It became his brand. With the acquittal in his pocket, McKenzie didn't retreat into the shadows. He expanded. He moved out of the estates and into the leafy, affluent suburbs. He bought a sprawling property on a quiet street in Cheadle Hulme, the kind of place where doctors and lawyers raise their families. He projected the image of a successful businessman, but the business was a phantom. To the taxman, Craig McKenzie was a man of modest means. He declared an annual income of roughly £33,000. It was a respectable, if unremarkable, wage. It was the kind of money that buys a used Ford Focus, not a fleet of luxury vehicles. Yet, the driveway told a different story. It was a showroom of arrogance. There was the Audi Q7 for the family run, the BMW X5 for the business meetings. And mostly, there was the lifestyle. The designer clothes, the holidays, and the accessories. This is where the discipline of the old-school gangster clashed with the ego of the modern criminal. The smart move is to live quietly, to hoard the cash in the walls and drive a Volvo. But McKenzie wanted the world to know he had won. He incorporated a company, a legitimate front for his illegitimate millions. In a display of staggering narcissism, he named it Teflon Holdings. It was a joke shared with the underworld, a middle finger raised directly at the Greater Manchester Police and the NCA. He was practically daring them to look at the books. The mechanics of his empire were sophisticated. McKenzie wasn't getting his hands dirty with street deals anymore. He was operating in the stratosphere of the drug trade. He was the banker and the transporter for high-level cartels. Using a network of drivers and safe houses, he moved vast quantities of cocaine and cannabis across the UK. But his true value lay in the money laundering. The drug game generates mountains of physical cash. Dirty, bulky, incriminating paper. McKenzie's service was turning that liability into an asset. He would take the street cash, filter it through shell companies and complex accounting tricks, and return it to the cartels as digital currency or legitimate assets, taking a healthy cut for his trouble. He operated with the confidence of a man who owned the city. But the landscape of crime was changing. The days of burner phones and code words spoken in back rooms were ending. The new battlefield was digital. A serious organized crime had migrated to encrypted communication platforms, specifically a network called EncroChat. These modified Android devices, costing thousands of pounds a year, were sold with the promise of military-grade encryption. No GPS, no microphone, no camera, and a panic wipe feature that could delete everything in seconds. For men like McKenzie, EncroChat was the holy grail. It allowed them to conduct business openly, discussing kilos of cocaine and millions of pounds as casually as ordering a pizza. McKenzie felt safe behind the encryption. On the network, he adopted a handle that shielded his identity. Or so he thought. He chatted with contacts in Europe, arranging transport, haggling over prices, and coordinating the movement of dirty money. He didn't know that the walls of his digital fortress had already been breached. In 2020, French and Dutch investigators, working with the NCA, cracked the EncroChat server. They didn't just shut it down, they harvested the data. Millions of messages from thousands of criminals were suddenly in the hands of law enforcement. The NCA began to read. They found a user who seemed to be at the center of the Manchester web. This user discussed spin, leading a reference to money laundering. They discussed logistics. They discussed the price of high-end watches. The investigators began the painstaking work of attribution linking the digital ghost to a physical human being. They looked for clues in the messages. Birthdays, locations, pictures of dogs, mentions of cars. And then they looked at Craig McKenzie, the man who called his company Teflon Holdings, the man with the £33,000 income and the millionaire's postcode. The surveillance teams were deployed. The National Crime Agency, the UK's answer to the FBI, began to shadow his every move. They watched him leave his gated home in Cheadle Hulme. They watched him meet with associates in car parks and lay BYS. They watched the brazen confidence of his routine. But the most damning evidence wasn't found in a dark alley. It was found on his wrist. During the investigation, detectives zeroed in on his assets. They noted the cars, the house, and the jewelry. They traced the purchase of the Richard Mille watch, £250,000. It is a sum of money that most people will labor for a decade to earn. McKenzie wore it to the supermarket. The disparity was the key. In the world of financial investigation, lifestyle is evidence. If you spend what you haven't earned, you are a criminal until proven otherwise. The NCA built a financial profile that was impossible to reconcile with his tax returns. They documented every pound he spent and compared it to every penny he declared. The gap was a black hole of illicit finance. The net tightened slowly. McKenzie, oblivious to the fact that his private EncroChat messages were being read by analysts in London, continued his operations. He believed the police were checking for drugs in boots, not reading the digital ledger of his life. He continued to launder, to organize, and to flaunt. He was the Teflon Don, untouchable and supreme. Then came the dawn raids. It was a coordinated strike across the UK, the culmination of Operation Venetic. For McKenzie, it ended with the shattering of glass and the shouting of armed officers. The sanctuary of his Cheadle Hulme home was breached. Police swarmed the property, securing the exits, seizing devices, and freezing the scene. McKenzie was taken into custody, stripped of his bravado and his watch. As the officers searched the house, the physical reality of his crimes became clear. They found the trappings of wealth that had no paper trail. They seized the cars. They seized the designer goods. But the real weapon was the data. In the interrogation room, McKenzie likely expected the usual dance. He would say nothing. He would wait for his lawyer. He would rely on the silence of his associates. But the police didn't need his associates to talk. They placed the transcripts of his own messages in front of him. They showed him his own words, his own deals, his own admissions of guilt, time-stamped and verified. The Teflon defense crumbled. You cannot argue with your own digital footprint. The messages revealed he wasn't just a participant. He was a principal player. He had laundered millions of pounds. He had facilitated the movement of Class A drugs on an industrial scale. The arrogance of naming his company Teflon Holdings now looked less like a masterstroke and more like a confession. It was used against him, a symbol of his total disregard for the law. The trial was a dismantling of a myth. The prosecution laid out the two lives of Craig McKenzie. There was the paper life, the modest earner, the family man, the taxpayer. And there was the real life, the EncroChat user, the money launderer, the gangster. The Richard Mille watch sat at the center of the case, a gleaming piece of evidence that proved he was living a lie. The jury was asked a simple question. How does a man on 33 grand buy a £250,000 watch? There was no answer McKenzie could give that didn't incriminate him. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty. The judge, looking down at the man who thought he could never be touched, delivered a scathing assessment. He spoke of McKenzie's arrogance, his greed, and his toxicity to the community of Manchester. The sentence was severe. 20 years. 2 decades of life, traded for a few years of high living and a watch he could no longer wear. As McKenzie was led away to the cells, the reality of his new life set in. There would be no luxury cars in prison, no designer suits, and certainly no Richard Mille watches. The Teflon had finally peeled away, leaving just another prisoner in a grey tracksuit. The fall of Craig McKenzie sent a shockwave through the Manchester underworld. It was a message from the NCA that the old rules no longer applied. You could no longer hide behind shell companies or encrypted phones. You could no longer mock the system with names like Teflon Holdings. If you lived the life, they would find you. They would follow the money, they would crack the codes, and they would come for everything. Today, the house in Cheadle Hulme is quiet. The cars are sold. The watch is in an evidence locker or auctioned off under the Proceeds of Crime Act. But the story remains a warning. It is a modern parable of the drug trade. It reminds us that while you might be able to wash the money, and you might be able to hide the drugs, you can never truly hide the greed. In the end, Craig McKenzie wasn't taken down by a rival gang or a snitch. He was destroyed by his own reflection in the mirror, by the need to show the world he was a king, and by the watch that counted down the seconds to his own destruction.